She thought it was just another flight, until a flight attendant turned the entire cabin against her. What started as a simple request quickly spiraled into a battle of power, perception, and control, where one wrong move could cost her everything. But Naomi Caldwell isn't just any passenger, and she's about to show them why. Buckle up. This flight is about to take an unexpected turn. Before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. The airport was buzzing with its usual rhythm. Rolling suitcases clicking against polished floors, distant flight announcements echoing overhead, and the faint aroma of coffee mingling with the scent of recycled air. Naomi Caldwell stood in line at the security checkpoint, shifting her weight from one foot to the other as she scrolled through her phone. Another day, another flight. She was used to this routine by now: boarding passes, baggage claims, the hum of jet engines before takeoff. But today felt different. Her inbox was cluttered with messages, most of them from reporters asking for statements about the recent discrimination case she had won. It had been a high-profile lawsuit against a major corporation accused of systematically underpaying women of color. Naomi had fought tooth and nail for months, and the verdict had come down in her favor. Yet as much as the victory should have felt triumphant, it left her with an unsettling fatigue. She exhaled and swiped the notifications away. Her flight to San Francisco was in 2 hours, giving her just enough time to grab a coffee before heading to the gate. As she walked through the terminal, her phone vibrated in her hand. An unknown number. She debated ignoring it, but something in her gut told her to answer. Hello? A pause, then a low, deliberate voice came through. You don't know when to quit, do you? Naomi stopped in her tracks. The background noise of the airport suddenly felt distant. Excuse me, she said, tightening her grip on her phone. You should be careful, the voice continued. Some fights aren't worth winning. Click. The line went dead. Naomi lowered the phone slowly, her pulse quickening. She glanced around, scanning the faces in the crowd, but no one seemed out of place. Just tired travelers, parents wrangling restless kids, businessmen glued to their laptops. She swallowed hard and forced herself to move forward. This wasn't the first time she had received threats. It came with the territory. But something about this one gnawed at her, like a whisper in the back of her mind telling her this was only the beginning. She shook it off and made her way toward the Western Skies Airlines check-in counter. The young agent at the desk greeted her with a bright but rehearsed smile. Good afternoon, ma'am. May I see your ID? Naomi handed over her license, her mind still half on the phone call. The agent clicked through her screen, then printed Naomi's boarding pass, sliding it across the counter. You're in seat 3A today, first-class cabin, the woman said. Thanks. Naomi took the ticket and turned toward security. As she walked, she became acutely aware of the weight of the past few weeks pressing down on her. The trial had taken everything out of her. The long hours, the media scrutiny, the backlash. She had fought harder than ever, yet it felt like there was always another battle waiting just around the corner. All she wanted was a few hours of peace on this flight, a quiet trip to San Francisco, a chance to reset before the next fight. She just hoped the universe would allow her that much. She had no idea what was waiting for her at 35,000 feet. Naomi approached the TSA checkpoint, slipping off her heels and placing her laptop into a plastic bin. She went through the motions automatically. Coat off, arms up, security wand sweeping over her as the agent nodded her through. The phone call still lingered in the back of her mind. She had received threats before, but something about this one felt personal, as if the voice on the other end had been watching her, waiting for the right moment. She shook it off. She wasn't going to let fear dictate her movements. After clearing security, she made her way to Gate B12. The first-class waiting area was sparsely occupied. Business travelers hunched over their laptops, a retired couple flipping through a travel magazine, and a few scattered passengers lost in their own worlds. She set her carry-on beside her seat and exhaled slowly, pressing her fingers against her temples. A flight attendant walked past, straightening the brochures near the counter. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the final boarding call for Western Skies Airlines Flight 319 to San Francisco. First-class passengers may now proceed to the boarding lane. Naomi stood, adjusting her blazer before making her way to the jet bridge. She handed her boarding pass to the gate agent, who barely glanced at her before scanning it. Enjoy your flight. the woman said in a monotone voice. Naomi stepped onto the plane, the familiar scent of recirculated air and coffee greeting her. She found her seat, 3A by the window, and settled in, placing her bag beneath the seat in front of her. As she fastened her seatbelt, she noticed a flight attendant moving down the aisle. A tall man with neatly combed blonde hair and an expression that could only be described as indifferent. His name tag read, Philip Graves. Would you like a beverage before takeoff? His tone was polite, but there was something about the way he looked at her, just a fraction of a second too long, that made her pause. I'll take a water, please. Philip didn't write anything down. Instead, he gave her a slow, almost knowing nod before moving on to the next passenger. Naomi frowned slightly but pushed the thought aside. Maybe she was just on edge after the phone call. The rest of the first-class cabin began filling up. An older woman, wearing a pearl necklace and a well-tailored suit, slid into the seat across the aisle. She met Naomi's eyes and smiled warmly. Business or pleasure? She asked. Neither, Naomi replied with a small chuckle. Work. Same here, the woman said. Margaret Donnelly. And you? Naomi Caldwell. Margaret tilted her head slightly. I thought I recognized you. You're the attorney from that big case last week, aren't you? Naomi hesitated for a beat. I am. Margaret's smile widened. Good for you. About time someone did something about that nonsense. Naomi appreciated the sentiment, but before she could respond, a voice crackled over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Barry Thornton speaking. We'll be pushing back shortly and expect a smooth ride to San Francisco. Flight time is approximately 4 hours and 15 minutes. The engines hummed to life, and the plane began taxiing. Naomi leaned back against her seat, hoping that this flight would be uneventful. But as Philip walked past her row again, she caught something in his expression, something subtle, something unreadable. And for the first time in a long time, she had a bad feeling about this flight. Naomi adjusted in her seat, trying to shake off the unease settling in her chest. She wasn't usually one to read into small gestures, but something about Philip Graves didn't sit right with her. There was a quiet arrogance in the way he carried himself, like he believed he belonged here and others didn't. She exhaled, shifting her focus to the view outside. The tarmac stretched into the distance, bathed in the warm glow of the afternoon sun. A few ground crew members signaled to one another as they made their final checks. As the plane lifted off, Naomi felt the familiar pressure in her ears. She let her head rest against the seat and closed her eyes for a brief moment. Then a soft voice beside her broke the silence. So, tell me, Naomi, how does it feel? She turned her head to find Margaret watching her with genuine curiosity. How does what feel? Naomi asked. To win. Naomi hesitated, choosing her words carefully. It's complicated. Margaret raised an eyebrow. How so? Naomi folded her hands in her lap. Winning isn't always what people think it is. Sure, there's the verdict, the press, the headlines, but behind all of that, there's exhaustion. There's knowing that for every case I win, there are a dozen others just like it's still happening. Margaret nodded, tapping her manicured fingers against her armrest. I get that. I was a teacher for 30 years. You spend your whole life fighting to change something, and at the end of the day, you wonder if it even made a dent. Naomi studied her, surprised. You were a teacher? Margaret smiled. Middle school history. I made a lot of noise about equality in the classroom before it was fashionable to do so. Naomi found herself smiling back. And did it make a dent? Margaret leaned in slightly. Maybe not as big as I wanted, but a dent is still a dent. Naomi let those words sink in. Maybe that was enough, at least for now. Philip returned, moving swiftly down the aisle with a tray in hand. He placed a small plastic cup of water on Naomi's tray table, not bothering to meet her eyes. Here you go, he said flatly. Naomi frowned slightly. Thank you. Philip nodded, then turned his attention to the passenger behind her, his professional demeanor returning instantly. Margaret watched him go, then turned back to Naomi. Is it just me, or does he seem like someone who enjoys reminding people who's in charge? Naomi let out a small laugh. You noticed that too, Margaret smirked. I was a teacher, remember? I can spot a power-hungry bureaucrat from a mile away. Naomi appreciated the levity, But something in the back of her mind kept her on edge. She took a sip of her water, hoping the next few hours would pass without incident. But deep down, she had a feeling they wouldn't. Naomi shifted in her seat, trying to ignore the tightness in her chest. It wasn't just the flight. It was something about the way things were unfolding. The phone call at the airport, the subtle but deliberate indifference from Philip Graves, the way he had barely acknowledged her presence. She had dealt with people like him before, but something about this felt different. The plane had leveled out at cruising altitude, and the cabin was quiet except for the occasional rustling of newspapers and the faint murmur of conversations. A few rows back, a businessman spoke softly into his Bluetooth headset, while a flight attendant moved through the aisle, collecting empty cups and napkins. Naomi glanced at her water, untouched on the tray table. Margaret, who had been flipping through a magazine, leaned over slightly. "You all right?" Naomi hesitated. "Yeah, just thinking." Margaret studied her for a moment before nodding knowingly. "He's got that look about him, doesn't he?" Naomi turned to her, eyebrows raised. "Who?" Margaret tilted her head toward the front of the cabin. "Graves." Naomi exhaled, a humorless chuckle escaping her lips. "So it's not just me?" Margaret shook her head. "I've been around long enough to recognize when someone enjoys making people feel small." Before Naomi could respond, Philip returned, this time pushing the service cart. He moved efficiently, passing out drinks and snacks, his expression neutral but his posture rigid. When he reached Naomi's row, he barely glanced at her before placing a small packet of almonds and another cup of water on her tray table. Naomi looked up at him. "Excuse me, could I have a ginger ale?" Philip's eyes flicked to her for the briefest moment before he sighed, barely concealing his irritation. "We're only serving water at this time." Naomi frowned. "The gentleman in 2B just got a soda." Philip's lips tightened. He hesitated just a second too long before responding. "That was a special request." Naomi held his gaze, refusing to back down. Margaret shifted beside her. "Well, I'd like a ginger ale too. Is that a problem?" Philip's jaw tensed. "I'll check." He spun on his heel and pushed the cart forward, stopping at the next row without another word. Naomi let out a slow breath. "That wasn't subtle." Margaret folded her arms. "No, it wasn't. And I don't like it." Naomi pressed her fingers against her temples, feeling the weight of the moment settle in. This wasn't about a drink. It never was. It was about power, who had it, who didn't, and who made sure you knew where you stood. She'd spent years fighting battles like these in courtrooms, in boardrooms, in closed-door negotiations. But here, she was 35,000 feet in the air with nowhere to go. Margaret glanced at her, voice low. "Are you going to say something?" Naomi wasn't sure yet, but she knew one thing. She wasn't going to let it slide. And something told her this was only the beginning. Naomi sat back in her seat, fingers lightly tapping on her armrest. The tension in the air had shifted, subtle but undeniable. Margaret, too, seemed to feel it. She pursed her lips, her eyes narrowing slightly as she watched Philip move down the aisle, his posture stiff with controlled authority. Naomi had dealt with situations like this before, but never in a confined space like this. There was nowhere to step away, no conference room to retreat to, no judge to appeal to. Here, Philip Graves was in control, and he knew it. A few minutes later, another flight attendant, a young Latina woman with dark hair neatly pulled into a bun, approached Naomi's row. Her name tag read Elena Vasquez. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "Miss Caldwell, I wanted to personally apologize for the delay. Would you still like that ginger ale?" Naomi studied her for a moment, recognizing the quiet hesitance in her tone. This wasn't a simple correction of a service mistake. Elena was stepping into something bigger. "Yes, thank you," Naomi replied, keeping her voice even. Elena nodded and turned back toward the galley. Margaret exhaled sharply. "Now that's interesting." Naomi arched an eyebrow. "What is?" Margaret smirked knowingly. "The way she came over here, how careful she was. She knew." Naomi's thoughts mirrored Margaret's. Elena had approached her with the kind of caution that only came from knowing exactly what was at stake. A few moments later, Elena returned with the drink. She set it down gently on Naomi's tray and leaned in again, voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry about him," she said quickly, before straightening and walking away. Naomi's grip tightened around the armrest, so she wasn't imagining things. Philip Graves wasn't just dismissive. This was a pattern. Margaret shifted beside her. She's scared of him. Naomi nodded slightly. And she's not the only one. She picked up the cup of ginger ale, letting the condensation chill her fingers as she thought. The same way Philip had dismissed her, ignored her, withheld even the most basic level of service. She had seen it before. In offices where women were paid less for the same work, in boardrooms where their voices were talked over, in depositions where their concerns were brushed aside as exaggerations. The difference was, she wasn't used to it happening to her. Margaret spoke again, voice lower now. I wonder how many times he's gotten away with this. Naomi exhaled, pushing aside her growing frustration. Too many. At that moment, Philip reappeared, stopping at Naomi's row again. His face was unreadable, but his jaw was set, his hands clasped behind his back. Miss Caldwell, he said smoothly, his voice suddenly professional again. If there's an issue, I'd be happy to discuss it further, but I do ask that we not create unnecessary disruptions. Naomi tilted her head. Unnecessary disruptions? Philip's gaze flickered to Margaret, then back to Naomi. I simply want to ensure everyone on this flight has a comfortable experience. Naomi let his words settle for a moment before responding. Then maybe you should start with treating all passengers equally. A flash of irritation passed over his face before he quickly masked it. Enjoy your flight. With that, he turned and walked away, his shoulders squared, his pace deliberate. Margaret let out a quiet chuckle, shaking her head. He really thought that was going to scare you off. Naomi picked up her drink, swirling the liquid slightly. Oh, I think he's just getting started. Margaret's expression turned serious. And what about you? Naomi met her gaze, her jaw tightening slightly. So am I. She wasn't going to let this go. Not this time. Naomi sat still, her fingers resting on the edge of her tray table. The cabin remained peaceful on the surface, but beneath it an invisible tension simmered. Philip Graves had made his stance clear. He expected compliance. He expected her to back down, but he had underestimated her. Margaret adjusted in her seat beside Naomi, sighing as she folded her arms. You ever notice how some men carry themselves like the world owes them a favor? Naomi smirked, but her eyes remained fixed ahead. I've spent my entire career noticing that. Margaret chuckled, shaking her head. It never stops being exhausting, does it? No, Naomi admitted, but you learn how to handle it. Margaret hummed in agreement and glanced toward the galley. Well, looks like your friend's got company. Naomi followed her gaze. Philip had cornered Elena Vasquez near the service station. From where she sat, Naomi couldn't hear the words, but she didn't need to. Philip's stance said enough. His body was rigid, leaning slightly toward Elena, while her posture was the opposite, shoulders drawn in, head slightly tilted down. A defensive stance. Naomi tapped her fingers against her tray table, thinking. She could let this slide, pretend she hadn't noticed, hope it didn't escalate, or she could do what she had always done. She unfastened her seatbelt. Margaret blinked. Where are you going? Naomi slid out of her seat, keeping her tone light. To stretch my legs. She made her way toward the galley, walking slow and deliberate. Philip's back was to her, and Elena's eyes flickered toward Naomi for the briefest second before darting away. That was all Naomi needed. Excuse me, she said casually. Philip turned, and for the first time, there was something new in his expression, a flicker of irritation that he didn't bother to hide this time. Yes? Naomi leaned slightly against the partition, crossing her arms. Just stretching my legs. Long flight. Philip's lips pressed together, but he nodded. Of course. Can I get you something? I think I'm good, Naomi said smoothly, glancing toward Elena. Unless I'm interrupting something. Elena opened her mouth as if to speak, but Philip's response was quicker. Just discussing some service adjustments, he said. Internal matters. Naomi smiled, though there was no warmth in it. That's so? Philip didn't respond. Naomi turned slightly to Elena. Are you all right? Elena hesitated. Just a brief second, but long enough for Naomi to notice. I'm fine. Philip's jaw clenched. Miss Caldwell, I'd appreciate it if you returned to your seat. Naomi exhaled slowly, meeting his eyes. You know what I'd appreciate? A flight where everyone is treated with the same level of professionalism? Think we can manage that? Silence. Then Philip smiled, tight-lipped, forced. Of course. Naomi held his gaze for a beat longer, before nodding slightly. Good. She turned and walked back toward her seat. As she settled in, Margaret let out a low whistle. Well, that was fun. Naomi picked up her water, taking a slow sip. We'll see. She had made her move. Now she just had to wait for his. Naomi leaned back in her seat, letting the hum of the engines fill the silence between her and Margaret. The tension that had been simmering since takeoff was no longer just a feeling. It was a presence. Something had shifted. Philip Graves knew she wasn't going to let this slide, and now it was only a matter of time before he responded. Margaret sighed, flipping through the in-flight magazine without much interest. You know, I once told myself I'd stop getting into fights I couldn't win. Naomi glanced at her. And how'd that work out for you? Margaret smirked. Let's just say I don't like losing. Naomi smiled, but her mind was elsewhere. She had seen the way Philip stood over Elena, the way he barely masked his irritation when Naomi interrupted. Men like him didn't take well to being challenged. As if on cue, Philip reappeared, this time walking deliberately down the aisle. He didn't look at Naomi, didn't acknowledge her presence, but his stride was slower, more calculated. Then, without a word, he stopped at the row ahead of her and leaned toward the passenger seated there, a middle-aged man in a navy suit. Sir, Philip said, his voice low and professional, I'm so sorry to bother you, but it appears there's been a seating issue. Would you be willing to move to another seat to accommodate a passenger with special circumstances? Naomi's fingers tensed against the armrest. The man blinked in surprise. I guess, but what kind of special... Philip cut him off with a smile. I'll make sure you're compensated for the trouble. The businessman hesitated but nodded. Sure, I guess. Philip straightened and gestured toward another seat further back in first class. As the man stood and gathered his things, Philip turned his attention to Naomi. Miss Caldwell, since we have an open seat, I'm going to have to ask you to relocate. Margaret sat up straight. Oh, you have got to be kidding me. Naomi exhaled slowly, keeping her voice even. Why? Philip gave a practiced smile. We've had a passenger request additional space for medical reasons. It's a policy adjustment. Naomi didn't move. That's interesting, because I just watched you remove someone from that seat. If it was for medical reasons, shouldn't they have been sitting there in the first place? Philip's expression didn't falter, but Naomi saw the slight twitch at the corner of his jaw. It's airline policy, he said smoothly. Naomi studied him, weighing her options. He wanted control, wanted her to be the one to push back, to raise her voice, to make a scene so he could call security and label her the problem. She wasn't going to give him that. Instead, she relaxed into her seat, tilting her head slightly. That's all right, she said, smiling just enough for it to be a challenge. I'm comfortable where I am. Philip's smile thinned. Margaret, sensing the moment, leaned in and crossed her arms. Funny thing about policy, she said, looking up at him, it tends to change depending on who's enforcing it. Philip's grip on his service tablet tightened just a little. Then after a long pause, he gave a curt nod. Very well, he said through his teeth. He turned and walked away. Margaret let out a breath. That man is a special kind of petty. Naomi nodded, but she wasn't smiling. Philip had just played his first real move. She had a feeling the next one would be worse. Naomi adjusted in her seat, keeping her breathing steady. She had seen men like Philip Graves before. People who thrived on control, who wielded authority like a weapon. His attempt to relocate her had failed, but he wasn't done. She could feel it in the way he moved, in the way he had masked his frustration behind a professional facade. Margaret shook her head. I swear some people just don't know when to quit. Naomi gave a small, dry chuckle. Oh, he knows, that's the problem. A few rows ahead, Philip had stopped at the galley, speaking in hushed tones with another flight attendant. Naomi couldn't hear what was being said, but Elena Vasquez's face told her everything. The young woman's expression was tense, her hands gripping the beverage cart a little too tightly. Then, without another word, Elena turned, pushing the cart down the aisle. Philip lingered for a moment, glancing in Naomi's direction before disappearing behind the curtain that led to the cockpit. Margaret leaned in. That looked like an important conversation. Naomi's gaze stayed on Elena as the flight attendant approached, stopping at their row. "Would you like anything to drink?" Elena asked, her voice polite but slightly strained. Naomi hesitated before answering. "Just water, please." Elena nodded and set a plastic cup on Naomi's tray table. But as she straightened up, she slipped a folded napkin into Naomi's hand. Naomi stilled. Elena didn't say another word. She simply pushed the cart forward, continuing down the aisle as if nothing had happened. Margaret, who had noticed the exchange, raised an eyebrow. "Well, that was subtle." Naomi carefully unfolded the napkin beneath the tray table, keeping it hidden from view. "Be careful." He went to the cockpit, told the captain you were disrupting service. Naomi inhaled through her nose, forcing herself to stay calm. This was exactly what she had suspected. Philip wasn't going to confront her directly. He was going to go through official channels, setting up a narrative where she was the problem. Margaret peeked over. "Do I even want to know what that says?" Naomi handed her the napkin. Margaret read it, her lips tightening. "So now we're playing dirty." Naomi thought for a moment before speaking. "He's trying to build a case before making his next move." Margaret scoffed. "And let me guess, next move is to have you escorted off the plane like some kind of criminal?" Naomi exhaled. "Or worse, have me arrested when we land." Margaret's jaw tensed. "Well, that's not happening." Naomi wasn't planning on letting it happen either, but she knew that logic and truth wouldn't be enough. She needed to get ahead of this. She pulled out her phone, opened the Notes app, and started typing. If Philip was setting up a case, she would set up one of her own. She noted every interaction, every comment, every moment that had felt off. Then she did something she had never done before. She opened her camera and started recording, not in an obvious way, just enough to capture the moment, the quiet hum of the plane, the way Philip carried himself when he reappeared, the way Elena's eyes darted around the cabin, as if she was waiting for something to go wrong. Margaret glanced at Naomi's phone and smirked. "Smart." Naomi tucked the device onto her lap, still recording. Let's see how he likes playing by his own rules. She wasn't just a passenger anymore. She was a witness. Naomi kept the camera running, the phone nestled against her lap. She wasn't reckless. She knew that in situations like this, perception mattered more than truth. Philip Graves had already taken the first step in framing her as a problem. Now she had to ensure there was a record of everything that happened next. Margaret sat beside her, arms crossed, her eyes darting between Naomi and the front of the cabin. "I hate to break it to you, but he's up to something." Naomi didn't need the warning. She could feel it. The curtain leading to the cockpit shifted, and Captain Barry Thornton stepped out, his presence commanding in the confined space of the first-class cabin. He adjusted his uniform, his expression unreadable as he whispered something to Philip. Naomi's grip tightened around her phone. "Here we go." The captain turned and walked toward her row, his polished shoes making soft but deliberate sounds against the carpet. When he stopped at her seat, the cabin seemed to grow quieter. "Miss Caldwell," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "May I speak with you for a moment?" Naomi slowly set down her water. "Of course." Thornton glanced around the cabin, then gestured toward the front. "Would you mind stepping toward the galley?" Margaret snorted. "Sounds more like an interrogation than a conversation." The captain ignored her, his eyes on Naomi. She studied him for a moment, then exhaled and stood. Whatever this was, she needed to face it head-on. As she followed the captain toward the galley, she caught Elena's eyes from a few rows away. The young flight attendant looked tense, as if she knew what was about to happen but couldn't stop it. Philip stood nearby, arms crossed, radiating satisfaction. Thornton stopped and turned to face her, lowering his voice just enough to keep it between them. "I was informed that there's been an issue with your behavior during the flight." Naomi arched an eyebrow. "An issue?" Philip stepped forward slightly. "Captain, I can confirm that Miss Caldwell has repeatedly disrupted service, challenged crew members, and created an uncomfortable environment for other passengers." Naomi folded her arms. "By asking for the same service as everyone else?" Thornton's expression didn't change. "Miss Caldwell, I need to make sure this flight remains smooth for all passengers." Naomi met his eyes, refusing to look away. then maybe you should be speaking to the person actually causing the problem. Philip let out a quiet chuckle. You see? This is exactly what I was talking about. Naomi's jaw tightened, but she forced herself to stay composed. Let's get something straight. I haven't raised my voice, I haven't disobeyed any instructions, and I haven't disrupted a single passenger. If you'd like to check with your other flight attendants, I'm sure they'll confirm that. Thornton hesitated. Naomi saw it, the flicker of uncertainty. He had expected an argument, not a measured response. Philip, however, wasn't backing down. Captain, if she continues to be combative, we have the authority to remove her upon landing. Naomi took a breath and pulled out her phone, holding it up just enough for them to see the recording running on the screen. Philip's expression darkened. Funny thing about accusations, Naomi said calmly. They're harder to make when there's evidence to the contrary. Thornton's posture stiffened. Naomi didn't miss the way he shifted slightly away from Philip, as if realizing he was being dragged into something he didn't want to be part of. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then finally, Thornton exhaled and nodded once. Let's keep things professional for the remainder of the flight. It was as close to an admission of guilt as she would get. Philip, however, was far from done. His jaw clenched as Thornton walked away, leaving him standing there seething. Naomi gave him a small, knowing smile. Guess we'll both have to behave, won't we? Philip didn't answer. He just turned sharply and stormed back toward the galley. As Naomi returned to her seat, Margaret let out a low whistle. Well, that was satisfying. Naomi picked up her phone, checking the recording. It's not over. Margaret leaned back. No, but I think you just made an enemy for life. Naomi took a sip of her water, the cold liquid grounding her. She knew one thing for sure. Philip Graves had just lost the upper hand. Naomi placed her phone back onto her lap, the recording still running subtly. She had played her move, and for the first time, Philip Graves had been forced to retreat. But she knew better than to think this was over. Margaret leaned in slightly, keeping her voice low. He's fuming. Naomi didn't look toward the galley, but she didn't need to. She could feel the weight of Philip's anger pressing against the back of her seat, like a storm gathering just behind her. I know, she murmured. Margaret crossed her arms. He's not done. Men like that never take a loss quietly. Naomi exhaled. I'm counting on it. The overhead speakers crackled to life. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're currently cruising at 35,000 feet and expect to arrive in San Francisco on schedule. We appreciate your cooperation and hope you enjoy the remainder of the flight. A polite professional announcement, but Naomi heard something else beneath it. A carefully orchestrated calm, a reminder that despite everything, Philip still had influence. A few minutes passed. Then movement at the front of the cabin caught her attention. Philip had returned, this time approaching the first-class intercom panel. Naomi sat up straighter. Margaret, noticing her shift, whispered, What's he doing? Philip picked up the handset, his face impassive as he pressed a button. A soft chime rang through the cabin and then, Attention, passengers. We'd like to remind you that we are committed to providing a comfortable and safe experience for everyone aboard. Any disruptive behavior will be taken seriously and addressed accordingly. The words were carefully chosen, neutral on the surface but heavy with subtext. Naomi clenched her jaw. This was his next move. He couldn't remove her, so he was setting her up, turning the passengers against her before she had even done anything. Margaret let out a slow breath. Oh, that's low. Naomi kept her expression neutral. If Philip thought she was going to react, he was wrong. But then, a passenger across the aisle, a man in his 50s wearing a golf polo, turned slightly toward her. Guess some people can't help themselves, he muttered under his breath. It wasn't loud, but it was loud enough. Naomi's stomach tightened. She had spent her whole life navigating these moments, the carefully veiled hostility, the implication that she was the problem before she had even done anything. Philip had just turned perception into a weapon. Margaret, however, wasn't having it. She shifted in her seat and shot the man a sharp look. Some people sure do love making assumptions, she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. The man huffed and looked away, but Naomi knew the damage had been done. Philip's words were an invitation, an unspoken call for passengers to start seeing her as a disruption, as a problem to be handled, and it was working. A woman 2 rows ahead subtly leaned toward her husband, whispering something while darting a glance toward Naomi. Another passenger shook his head slightly, as if already convinced that she was causing trouble. Philip had just made her the center of the wrong kind of attention. Naomi exhaled slowly. This wasn't about her anymore. This was about the pattern. How easily a man in authority could twist the perception of a situation, plant an idea, and watch it grow. Margaret glanced at her. What's the plan? Naomi's mind worked fast. She had 2 options. Sit quietly, let the flight end, and hope Philip didn't escalate further, or take control of the narrative before it slipped entirely from her hands. She made her decision. She reached for her phone again. Margaret frowned. You sure? Naomi gave a small nod. Philip had just used his platform to paint her as a problem. She was about to use hers to tell the truth. She opened her camera, turned it to selfie mode, and hit record. She kept her voice steady, her expression calm, but her words were deliberate. I want to document what's happening right now. A flight attendant, Philip Graves, has been targeting me since the beginning of this flight. I have been nothing but calm, and yet I just witnessed him make an announcement designed to paint me as a problem before I have done anything wrong. Margaret let out a quiet, damn. Naomi kept going. I want this recorded because I know how this goes. I know how people like me are treated when authority decides we're inconvenient. She stopped the recording, saved the video, and sent it to her assistant with a simple message. Hold on to this, just in case. Philip thought he had control, but Naomi was about to show him just how wrong he was. Naomi locked her phone and placed it on her lap, her fingers resting lightly over the screen. The weight of the recording settled in her mind. Not as a burden, but as a shield. Philip had tried to control the narrative. Now she had one of her own. Margaret, still watching her closely, smirked. I've got to say, I've seen a lot of power plays in my time, but that was a smart move. Naomi exhaled. It won't stop him, but at least it won't just be his word against mine. Margaret nodded. Well, good, because if he pulls anything else, I'll start recording too. Hell, I'll narrate it. Naomi let out a quiet chuckle, but the tension in her shoulders remained. Philip had lost the last round, but she could feel it. He wasn't done. She glanced toward the front of the cabin. Philip was still near the galley, standing stiffly as he spoke with Captain Barry Thornton again. This wasn't just a minor annoyance for him anymore. She had forced him onto the defensive, and men like him didn't handle that well. A few minutes passed, and then Philip moved back down the aisle. He didn't stop at her row this time, but she saw the flicker of a smirk on his face as he passed. Margaret leaned over. I don't like that. Neither did Naomi. Philip returned to his duties, moving through the cabin as if nothing had happened. But the atmosphere had changed. Naomi could feel the shift. A few passengers were watching her now, their expressions unreadable. Some were just curious. Others, she suspected, had already made up their minds. A flight attendant bringing drinks to the row ahead hesitated before offering Naomi anything. Naomi gave a small smile. I'll take another water if that's all right. The attendant, not Elena this time, nodded quickly, handing her a cup before moving on. Margaret scoffed. They're nervous. Naomi didn't respond. She didn't blame them. But then, a new development. 2 uniformed officers entered the first-class cabin. Naomi's stomach clenched. They were airport security personnel, not police, but their presence sent a clear message. Margaret whispered, Tell me they're not here for you. Naomi's throat was dry. She already knew the answer. Philip, who had been standing near the galley, stepped forward, suddenly all professionalism and concern. Officers, he said smoothly, his voice just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. Thank you for coming so quickly. We've had an ongoing issue with a passenger being uncooperative with the crew. The words hung in the air like a trap snapping shut. The officer in front, a tall man with a serious expression, nodded once. Where is the passenger in question? Philip turned and pointed directly at Naomi. Margaret let out a low, furious breath. Oh, hell no! Naomi, forcing herself to remain calm, straightened in her seat. I'd be happy to talk to you, she said evenly. She didn't miss the way Philip's mouth twitched, annoyed that she wasn't reacting. One of the officers stepped forward. "We just need to confirm what's going on." Naomi nodded. "That's fine. But before we start," she picked up her phone, holding it up for them to see. "I have a full recording of everything that's happened on this flight, including the moment Philip here tried to relocate me without cause, and the announcement he made to turn other passengers against me." Philip's smirk vanished instantly. The officer hesitated. His eyes flicked to Philip, then back to Naomi. Naomi kept her expression neutral. "So, before we continue, I'd just like to know, am I being accused of something? Or is this just a conversation?" The lead officer shifted slightly. "Just a conversation." Naomi nodded, pressing her phone against her lap. "Good." Philip looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. Margaret, sensing an opportunity, leaned forward with a slow smile. "Well, since we're all clearing things up, I'd love to know what exactly constitutes uncooperative behavior on this flight. Because from where I'm sitting, all Miss Caldwell did was ask for the same treatment as everyone else." One of the officers, the younger of the two, glanced around the cabin. Several passengers were now watching the interaction closely. The officer exhaled, then turned to Philip. "We'll need a written report of the incident after landing. But unless there's an immediate safety concern, I see no reason to escalate this any further." Philip froze. It wasn't the outcome he had expected. Naomi could see it in the way his fist clenched just slightly at his sides, the way his face remained blank, but his pulse visibly ticked at his temple. But there was nothing he could do. The lead officer nodded to Naomi. "Thank you for your cooperation, ma'am." With that, the two officers turned and exited the cabin. Margaret waited until they were gone before letting out a sharp, triumphant laugh. "That was beautiful." Naomi took a deep breath, setting her phone back down. "It's not over." Margaret's smile faded. "Number, but he knows he lost this round." Naomi looked toward the galley where Philip had vanished behind the curtain. He wasn't just angry now, he was humiliated, and that made him dangerous. Naomi could still feel the weight of Philip's glare, even though he had disappeared behind the galley curtain. She had forced his hand, exposed his attempt to manipulate the situation, and now he was left scrambling. But she wasn't naive. A man like Philip Graves wouldn't take humiliation lightly. Margaret leaned in, still riding the high of what had just happened. "That man is going to combust before we land." Naomi exhaled, shaking her head. "I wouldn't put it past him to try something else." Margaret's expression sobered. "You really think so?" "I know so." She had dealt with enough people in positions of authority who couldn't handle being challenged. They never stopped, not until they felt like they had won. The cabin had settled back into its routine, but Naomi noticed something different now. The passengers who had whispered, the ones who had looked at her with suspicion, now seemed unsure. Some had witnessed what just happened, a flight attendant calling security on a woman for doing absolutely nothing. And doubt had begun to creep in. Even the man in the golf polo, the one who had muttered about some people earlier, seemed uncomfortable now. That was the thing about people like Philip. They always took things too far. They pushed just a little too much until the facade cracked and others started to see them for what they were. Naomi took a sip of her water, still keeping a careful eye on the front of the cabin. She was waiting, watching for Philip's next move. And then he emerged again. She could tell by the way he walked, controlled but tense. She could almost hear the thoughts racing through his head. He had been forced to retreat, and now he needed to reassert himself. Margaret whispered, "Brace yourself." Philip didn't stop at Naomi's row. Instead, he walked a few seats ahead, stopping next to a well-dressed older man. Naomi watched as Philip leaned down slightly, speaking just loud enough for a few nearby passengers to hear. "I sincerely apologize for the earlier disruption," Philip said smoothly. "We take passenger comfort very seriously, and I appreciate your patience." Naomi's grip tightened around her armrest. Philip was still playing the game, still framing her as the problem without actually saying it outright. The older man gave a polite nod, murmuring something in response. Naomi couldn't hear it, but she didn't need to. She knew how Philip's type operated. This was his new approach, subtle damage control. Margaret scoffed. "He just can't help himself, can he?" Naomi's jaw tightened. "He's trying to plant seeds of doubt." Margaret smirked. "Well, we could do the same thing." Naomi glanced at her. What do you mean? Margaret tapped her fingers against her armrest. People like him expect you to defend yourself. They expect you to get mad, to react, to push back. But you know what they don't expect? Naomi arched a brow. What? Margaret grinned. Other people doing it for you. And then before Naomi could stop her, Margaret turned in her seat and spoke just loud enough for the people around them to hear. You know, I've flown first class plenty of times, and I have never seen a flight attendant go out of his way to target a passenger like that. Have you? Naomi froze. Philip, who had just finished speaking with the older man, stiffened. And then, it happened. The businessman in the row ahead turned slightly, looking back at them. No, he said slowly. I haven't. Margaret tilted her head. Weird, right? Naomi held back a smile. A woman across the aisle spoke next. I was wondering why security was even called. I didn't see her do anything. Another man, one of the quiet ones who had been watching carefully, nodded. Philip, realizing that the conversation had turned against him, straightened abruptly. Naomi met his eyes. This was checkmate. Philip's carefully crafted illusion had started to unravel. He had tried to manipulate the situation, but he had pushed too hard, and now people were talking. For the first time, Philip looked unsure. Naomi tilted her head slightly, a silent challenge. What now? Philip clenched his jaw, then turned sharply and walked back toward the galley. Margaret smirked, crossing her arms. Well, that was fun. Naomi exhaled, relaxing just a fraction. Philip Graves had lost control of the narrative. But there was still one final move left to play. Naomi watched as Philip stormed back toward the galley, his shoulders rigid, his movements sharper than before. He had lost control of the cabin, and he knew it. Margaret let out a satisfied sigh, stretching slightly in her seat. You ever see a man realize in real time that he's not as powerful as he thinks he is? Naomi smirked. Just now. But her mind was still working. Philip had been humiliated, but that didn't mean he was done. If anything, it meant he was more desperate. And desperate people made reckless decisions. The murmur of conversation in the cabin had shifted. Passengers were no longer eyeing Naomi with suspicion. They were curious now, whispering to each other about what they had seen. Some were nodding in agreement with Margaret's words. Others were frowning, as if questioning their initial assumptions. That was the thing about exposing someone like Philip. Once the illusion cracked, people started seeing things they hadn't noticed before. Naomi took another sip of water, keeping her expression neutral. Philip was still dangerous. And then, as if on cue, the overhead speakers crackled. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've received word of an issue in the first-class cabin, and as a precaution, security will be present upon landing to ensure all matters are resolved. A silence fell over the cabin. Naomi closed her eyes for half a second. There it was. Margaret's expression darkened. That son of a... Naomi shook her head slightly. Not here. Margaret inhaled sharply, but she got the message. Philip had just escalated the situation beyond the flight. He knew he had lost control up here, so he had taken it somewhere he still had influence. The ground. By the time they landed in San Francisco, security would be waiting. And even though Naomi had done nothing wrong, the narrative had now been framed around her. It didn't matter what was true. What mattered was how it looked. Margaret exhaled, rubbing her temples. This isn't about this flight anymore, is it? Naomi's jaw tightened. Number. This is about setting an example. Philip wanted to send a message, not just to her, but to every person who dared to push back. He wanted to show that no matter how calm, how rational, how careful you were, if they wanted to paint you as a problem, they could. But he had underestimated her. Naomi picked up her phone and sent another message to her assistant. Security waiting at landing. Contact legal team. Margaret noticed. What's the plan? Naomi looked toward the galley where Philip had vanished once again, waiting for the flight to end so he could watch her be escorted off the plane. She exhaled slowly, calm, deliberate. The plan, she said, locking her phone, is to make sure that when we land, he's the one with something to lose. Margaret's lips curled into a slow, approving grin. Now that's what I like to hear. Naomi settled back in her seat, the wheels in her mind turning. Philip thought this was the final move, but she was just getting started. Naomi adjusted her seatbelt as the captain announced their descent. The cabin grew quieter, passengers settling in, the anticipation of landing filling the air. But for her, this was the calm before the storm. Margaret sighed beside her, shifting uncomfortably. Well, this is going to be interesting. Naomi kept her voice low. It's going to be more than that. She could already see Philip standing near the galley, arms crossed, his gaze flicking toward her every so often. He wasn't gloating anymore. He was waiting. He thought this was over, that she had lost the game. But he had made a critical mistake. He had gone too far. The plane dipped lower, the lights of San Francisco glowing beneath them. Naomi could feel the subtle change in the air pressure. But the weight pressing against her wasn't from the altitude. It was from what was about to happen. She reached for her phone, her fingers moving fast. ETA, 15 minutes, be ready. She hit send. Margaret, glancing at her, smirked. I assume you're not texting a welcome committee? Naomi slipped her phone back into her pocket. Not exactly. Margaret hummed in approval. Good. The plane touched down with a smooth jolt, the hum of the engines slowing as they taxied to the gate. A few rows ahead, Philip shifted his stance, rolling his shoulders, preparing himself. He was still so sure that this was going his way. Naomi had seen men like him her entire career, men who operated in the gray areas of authority, manipulating perception, knowing that the system worked in their favor. But this time, he had underestimated the woman he picked a fight with. The seatbelt sign flicked off, and passengers began gathering their belongings. Naomi didn't rush. She had nowhere to go but forward. And then, the moment of truth. A uniformed security officer stepped onto the plane, speaking briefly with Philip. Passengers started noticing. Murmurs spread. People were paying attention now. Naomi stood, calm, composed. She collected her bag, straightening her blazer. Philip turned toward her, his expression neutral, but she saw the satisfaction lurking underneath. Miss Caldwell, he said smoothly, as if this was a casual conversation and not a calculated move on his part. Security would like a word with you before you deplane. Margaret scoffed. Oh, please. Naomi didn't react. She didn't need to, because behind the security officer, a woman stepped onto the plane. Not just any woman, Danielle Fisher, an attorney with the ACLU. Philip's expression barely changed, but Naomi saw the way his posture stiffened. Danielle, a tall black woman in a sharp navy suit, walked past security like she owned the space. She didn't look at Philip. She looked at Naomi. Naomi, she said, her tone cool, professional. Are you ready? Naomi smiled. I am, Margaret whispered. Oh, this is delicious. Philip, finally breaking his silence, frowned. What's going on here? Danielle turned to him, finally acknowledging his presence. I assume you're Philip Graves? Philip hesitated. Yes. Danielle gave a tight smile. Wonderful. We'll need to have a conversation about your actions on this flight. My team has been monitoring the situation, and we have concerns about your conduct. Philip blinked. This wasn't part of his plan. The security officer, now caught between two forces he hadn't anticipated, glanced between them. Ma'am, he addressed Naomi, we were called to handle a passenger disturbance. Danielle's smile didn't falter. Yes, and I'd like to formally request that any report on this matter be documented properly, because as of now, Miss Caldwell is considering legal action. Philip's face paled. The passengers around them were fully tuned in now. Some even had their phones out, recording the exchange. Margaret nudged Naomi, whispering, I think we just won. Naomi exhaled slowly, watching Philip realize in real time that his plan had completely backfired. The hunter had become the hunted. Philip's face remained blank, but Naomi saw it, the flicker of panic in his eyes. He had played his hand, expecting a smooth, controlled outcome where she was the one escorted off the plane, humiliated, powerless. But instead, he was the one under scrutiny. Passengers whispered, some tilting their phones discreetly, recording the scene. The shift had happened. He was no longer in control. The security officer, now clearly aware that this situation was bigger than what he was led to believe, straightened. Miss Caldwell, do you wish to step off the plane to discuss this further? Danielle's response was immediate. Number Miss Caldwell will deplane with the other passengers as scheduled. However, we would like a formal discussion with airline representatives regarding the situation. Philip's jaw clenched. That's unnecessary. Danielle turned to him, her expression cool, measured. You don't determine that. Philip opened his mouth, but before he could respond, another voice joined in. I'd actually like to add something, Margaret said, stepping forward with a perfectly polite smile. Since we're talking about conduct, I'd love to give my statement about the flight experience. I think a lot of passengers would. Naomi bit back a smirk. Margaret had just opened the floodgates. One row back, a businessman raised his hand slightly. Yeah, I saw how she was treated too. Seemed pretty unfair. A woman across the aisle nodded. Same here. Philip, for the first time, looked outnumbered. The security officer cleared his throat. Right. Well, we'll be taking notes on this incident, and I'll be reporting this to airport authorities for further review. Philip, visibly tense, nodded stiffly. Naomi didn't look away from him. She wanted him to feel it, the exact moment he realized he had lost. The security officer stepped aside. Miss Caldwell, you're free to deplane. Danielle nodded, gesturing for Naomi to move forward. Naomi walked past Philip, slow, deliberate. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. Margaret followed, barely concealing her pure enjoyment of the moment. You know, Naomi, I think this might have been the smoothest flight I've ever taken. Naomi finally allowed herself to smile. She stepped off the plane, walking into the terminal, knowing one thing for sure. Philip Graves would remember her for a very, very long time. And so would the airline. Naomi stepped into the terminal, the air feeling lighter than it had in hours. Around her, passengers from the flight dispersed into the bustling airport, some still glancing at her as if realizing, for the first time, what they had just witnessed. Danielle kept pace beside her, phone in hand. I already contacted the airline's legal department. They'll be scrambling to get ahead of this. Naomi exhaled. Good. Margaret, who had been trailing behind, let out a laugh. I hope they're fast, because something tells me this isn't going away quietly. She gestured toward a group of passengers just ahead, one of them holding up their phone, recording. Naomi barely reacted. The story had already started spreading. Philip had expected this to end with her being silenced, escorted off the plane like some disruptive passenger. Instead, he had ignited something bigger than himself. Naomi turned to Danielle. What's the next move? Danielle smirked. We let them come to us. Naomi nodded. She had played her part. Now the weight of this moment would carry itself forward. Margaret clapped her hands together. Well, ladies, I think this has been quite the eventful flight. Drinks, anyone? Naomi let out a breath, the first genuine laugh she'd had all day. That, she said, is the best idea I've heard so far. As they walked toward the exit, Naomi's phone buzzed. She glanced down. A new message. It was from an unknown number. You should have stayed quiet. Naomi stared at the words, her expression unreadable. Margaret noticed. Something wrong? Naomi locked her phone. Philip Graves was done. But the fight wasn't over. She gave a small, knowing smile. No, she said. It's just beginning. And with that, she walked forward, toward whatever was coming next. Naomi Caldwell's story isn't just about a single flight or a single injustice. It's about something much bigger. It's about how power is wielded, how perception can be manipulated, and how standing up for yourself isn't always enough. You need to be prepared, strategic, and unshakable. How many times have situations like this played out where no one was watching? How often do people like Philip Graves get away with their behavior simply because no one challenges them? Naomi didn't win because she was loud. She won because she was smart. This story is a reminder. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do to those who abuse power is refuse to let them control the narrative. What would you have done in Naomi's position? Have you ever witnessed or experienced a situation like this? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you don't want to miss more powerful stories like this one, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. There's always another battle for justice waiting to be told.